Megavon and friends, this is Dan for Digital.Flash.Fire. Today we are going to start our lore tour of Middle-earth using Lord of the Rings Online as a guide. We're going to go over places, characters, and experiences that you will see that are connected to all of the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien, not just The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but his letters, the Silmarillion, every little scrap and snippet that we can find. So we're going to start here in Celondim, and in the Elven starting area, which is actually, I guess, Falathlorn and Dwelon and all that. And this is where the elves go before they go to the Grey Havens, before they depart Middle-earth. And it is a beautiful area, but it is not necessarily a very interesting area. You know, you've got the one gray ship here, but all of the elves in this area are insignificant in terms of the lore. They aren't a factor in any of the books that I've been able to find, which is a little bit disappointing. You know, you have... I understand the reason they did that, because the elves here are all leaving. They're not sticking around. They're not going to be part of the War of the Ring. They're not going to be a factor in anything. They're on their way out. So they didn't want to bring anyone in. They don't want to have Glorfindel or some big-named elf that was actually nowhere near here. So lore-wise, you get to see some of the structure of it. You see, you know, as you saw on the map, you saw the Grey Havens. You see the architecture of the elves, including one of the few examples of guardrails you will ever see from elves. And that is really the extent of the lore that the elves bring to this, which is really unusual. Most of this game, elf lore is a tremendous part of the goings-on. But here it isn't, and that gives us an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the overall zone, which is called Ered Luin, the Blue Mountains. The Blue Mountains are one of the most important zones, not to the elves, but to the dwarves. To the elves, this is the exit. To the dwarves, this is the final refuge. At the end of the First Age, and during the War of Wrath, and again during the destruction of Beleriand, the dwarven cities, Noglond and Belagost, were destroyed, and most of the Blue Mountains were also destroyed. So that the mountains here that are just coming into view behind that ridge are just a rump. They are the remnant of the mountains that once housed many of the great cities of the dwarves. The Broadbeams and the Firebeard clans were incredibly connected to these areas, and once Beleriand was destroyed and once the northern Blue Mountains were cast into the ocean, they were basically demolished. They were forced to retreat, and most of the towns, the ruins, and the stronghold that we're going to get to at the other end were all inhabited for the first time by refugees from these northern cities. And this became important later on when the Lonely Mountain, when Erebor fell to Smaug, the dwarves remembered their refuge. They remembered where they had gone before. And so Thorin and company, and Thrain, remembered that, you know, where their fathers, where their uncles, where their cousins had gone when they needed respite, when they needed to be saved. And they went back there. So this refuge, not just Gondamon here, but even Thorin's Hall probably wasn't always Thorin's Hall. Thorin's Hall was most likely something else first, created by the dwarves who had fled the destruction of Beleriand and eventually became Thorin's Hall once Thorin and company gathered there. And this is kind of an interesting departure. I mean, you can see there are far more ruins than, or not even ruins, I mean, many of these are in very good repair, but there are far more areas to inhabit than the scattered survivors of Thorin's Hall would justify normally. Now, in game, the Dour Hands are a big explanation for this, but I think a lot more of that can be connected to the earlier evacuation, the flight from the fall of Beleriand. Now we're entering the Vale of Thrain. Thrain, of course, is the son of Thror and the father of Thorin, and he isn't a hugely important character in the books themselves or even in the movies, unless you get into the really, really extended edition. But he is the one that Gandalf meets in the dungeon of the Necromancer, and he is maddened and he can't remember who he is or anyone's name, and he can't even remember Gandalf, who he would have met before. But he has the map and the key to the Lonely Mountain, which is what gives Gandalf the impetus, or it gives Gandalf a tool to give Thorin a charge and get Thorin to push off, push away from his kind of, I don't want to say meaningless, but survivalist survivalist lifestyle, and begin the quest to reclaim the Lonely Mountain. Interestingly enough, there was almost no chance that they were going to succeed off their own resources. The whole force of the Lonely Mountain had not sufficed to hold off Smaug, and now they're going to go back and kill him themselves. It says a lot about the dwarves that they had faith in themselves and in Gandalf to deal with the dragon. So now we're entering Thorin's Gate, and Thorin's Gate is, of course, the central town of the dwarves. We're in Freren's court. Freren is the brother of Thorin. And so most likely he would have been, I believe he was killed outside of Moria. I believe he's one of the ones that fell. I don't believe he ever actually made it here, in other words. But that court is named in memorial to him. So now we're at Thorin's Gate itself. Pop through the door. And we are in Thorin's Hall. All of this, of course, named for Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror. And the hall is largely empty. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, this is a refuge. This is not a permanent home of the dwarves. The dwarves here are here basically as kind of a rear guard, kind of watchers over the ancestral home, if you will. Now, one of the surviving members of the unexpected party is Dwalin, and he is, of course, holding court here. Now, very few of them lived to see the War of the Ring. Dwalin, of course, did. And most of the ones that lived were in Erebor. They stayed there afterwards. Dwalin, of course, returned to Thorin's Hall. But for the most part, they stayed in the Lonely Mountain under King Dain Ironfoot. Or Dain Ironfoot, as people who speak English would call him. So that's basically it. There really aren't that many significant characters here either, which isn't as surprising as it might seem at first if you understand that this is not a city. This is a refuge. This is a temporary home. This is a relatively minor outpost, even for a race as thin on the ground as the dwarves. All right, folks, for Digital.Flash.Fire, this is Dan. We're going to continue this series. Next, we are going to go over Breeland, the human starting zone. Basically, we're going to be going over Bree and the surrounding towns. We aren't going to do the actual Bree, the wider Breeland area for a little bit yet, because first we have to do the Shire, and folks, the Shire is going to take a minute. So for Digital.Flash.Fire, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, give us some comments, let me know all of the wonderful words that I pronounced wrong. And thank you very much for your time.